Hello, we are here today with Dr. Paul Freaky and Richard Porsley from University of Wisconsin-Madison and Michigan State University. Dr. Jennifer Spencer and myself, Victor Gomez, from Texas A&M and K-State will be the hosts of this program. Today we will talk about high fertility programs, sex semen, pregnancy diagnosis, and resynchronization. It's going to be a great discussion, so stay tuned.
Our format is to provide unbiased, direct information. We want to go straight into a background and discussions, but we'd like to thank you guys for being with us today and taking your time.
You bet. Looking forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
I have been asked, or I have heard before, that all Repro programs are working. Everything is good. There are no problems with reproduction. We just need to choose one program and go for it. Are really all these Repro programs the same? Or what should we consider when choosing our reproductive program? Can you please comment on that?
I can go ahead and start. And we were talking a little bit about this before we started recording, but I think what I said is that when I look at different farms, I think there are a number of different ways that people can achieve good reproduction. I tend to stay away from just prescriptively telling people there's only one way to do reproduction, because it depends on the farm and their goals and the location and those sorts of things. Your question, though, is whether all reproductive programs are the same, and I would answer that no. I think they vary in the ability to improve service rates and conception rates. So there are some strategies that are more aggressive. The aggressive programs require more inputs, of course, but yeah, they're not all equal.
Yeah, that's right, and it is critical though that producers maximize conception rates on our pregnancy rates per AI. For first AI, I mean that's critical. I think once you can do that and you have acceptable pregnancy rates per AI for first service, the rest of the reproduction program can fall in place and do lots of different things, as Paul was saying. But I think the one thing you have to focus on is making sure that first service pregnancy rates per AI are really, really good, and it's partly because we have to get cows pregnant in a timely manner. I mean, that's the issues, right? I mean, we have to get them pregnant. If we don't, they don't go. If they get pregnant out past 150, 160 days, then we have more problems with them after they calve in the next time. So it's clearly an issue where we've got to focus our efforts on getting cows pregnant as soon as possible. And there's lots of different ways to do that.
And Richard, I wanted to expand on that a little bit, Richard, now that you kind of brought that up. I completely agree with you. First service is a key. We can manipulate them well at that first service, set the voluntary waiting period. But I want you to expand on a term that you kind of coined that we're calling the high fertility cycle. And I think that's really a key when we start to look at the reproductive success on these dairies, and one reason why we have really high pregnancy rates. So maybe just talk a little bit about that, Richard. I think it's important.
Yeah, Emily Middleton, when she was a master's student in my lab, did all this work, and it's not cause-effect, it's relationship type data, but nevertheless, cows that extend time to pregnancy are generally fatter at the time, and it makes sense. They're longer lactations, they're lower milk production, longer in that lactation, and so they're going to gain weight. They're going to be fatter, and it's those cows that end up with the longer lactations that get fatter, that end up losing too much body condition. And at Wisconsin, I know Paul and Milo and a number of other authors on this one paper back a few years ago had cows that either lost, maintained, or gained body condition during the first 21 days, right, Paul? Yep. Our data was first 30 days, very similar. And in the case where our cows that gained or that lost a lot of body condition during that first 30 days, it was pretty clear that they had lower fertility, lower first service conception rate. So if you can get into this high fertility cycle, if you can get cows pregnant sooner, they calve in at the right body condition, they come back up 70, 80 days later for first AI, they don't have the negative effects of the cows that lost body condition on the OSI when they come up for the next AI or the next lactation. So you get these cows into a cycle. So you get them pregnant sooner, they're higher fertility when they come back again the next time, and so on and so on. And we see herds that have been in that cycle. There's no doubt about it. And Paul's seen herds like that. I've seen herds. There's not lots of them, but if they can maintain that cycle and get more cows pregnant earlier, they seem to maintain very high fertility throughout.
And Victor, just one more comment I want to make on that, Richard, and is that I usually emphasize how profound the influences are on first service conception rate based on that body condition score change in that transition period. Our data, I think, fits really well with your data. But what we showed is that if we looked at that first 21 days, and this data goes all the way back to Jack Britt and the Britt hypothesis, which many people listening to this podcast are going to be familiar with. He did that. I think he gave that presentation back in '92. That's why we looked at the 21-day period. But cows that lost condition, and what we did is it was in a commercial herd, 2 of them, and they were all on a double ovsync program, which is a fertility program, which we'll talk about. But the cows that lost condition, and one thing I always clarify when I give these talks, not all cows lose condition. I think there's a misconception that all cows lose body condition post-calving. What we found is that somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% of the cows lost condition. They had a 25% conception rate at first service to a double ovsync program. We had another group of cows, about 40% of them, that maintained. In other words, they didn't lose or they didn't gain. They just didn't change during that period. They had about a 40% conception rate at that first service to double ovsync. And we had this group of cows that gained. It was over 20% of them in this study. And their first service conception rate, Richard, was over 80%. It was just phenomenal. And I'm not saying everybody's going to get 80%, but I mean, of all the manipulations we've done with fertility, this seems to be an association that really explains a lot of these differences. And I think it's probably one of the biggest impediments to high fertility I think we're dealing with right now in the dairy industry, because we've got good programs and protocols, but when those, a lot of people say, well, my program isn't working, I always tell them you got to look at the cows and the health of the cows and those sorts of things as well.
Let's start more into our discussion. Let me give you guys a background for this. So let's say we are in a dairy in Wisconsin or Michigan that has 1,000 high producing cows. So let's say 30,000 pounds of milk per lactation. These are Holstein cows in a freestyle barn, milk 3 times per day. And so this producer reproductive efficiency looks like this: a conception rate or pregnancy per insemination of 35%, service rate or heat rate of 65%, and then a 21-day pregnancy rate of 22%. This dairy has a voluntary waiting period of 70 days in milk and is currently using an ovsync protocol. So, Paul, what reproductive protocol, and you mentioned already, it depends on the goals of the farm and everything, but in this scenario, what do you think this producer or this herd should consider doing? And what should be a 21 pregnancy rate goal for herds in the US today, or at least in Wisconsin, let's say?
Sure. No, that's a really good question. I love kind of dealing with these scenarios. Again, let's assume that the goal of this dairy is to maximize their 21-day preg rate. And there's a lot of economic reasons why that should be your goal. I think that's a reasonable goal, that you want it to be as high as we can get it. I would say that 20 years ago, when we started looking at and measuring 21-day pregnancy rates, 20% preg rate was the pie in the sky goal. That was there was only about 10 or 15% of herds that could achieve an annualized 21-day pregnancy rate above 20%. This was before we could get herds in the high fertility cycle. This is really before we had fertility programs. So you mentioned that this particular herd is using an OVSync protocol. I'm assuming that's just a straight OVSync protocol with no pre-synchronization. And again, Richard was involved with actually the development of the OVSync protocol back in the mid 1990s, early 1990s. I would say they're using a very outdated approach, because now we've got what we call fertility programs. And I'm going to assume that this herd, if they're using OVSync for first insemination, they're committed to kind of timed insemination for their first breeding. Would that be correct, Victor? They're pretty much submitting cows that way. So my advice to that farm would be, okay, if you're already committed to doing a timed insemination, let's use the best program we can use. And straight OVSync is not the best program we can use. So of the fertility programs, I think there's really two of them. A good G6G type of a protocol, which Richard has worked on, or a double OVSync protocol. Both of those protocols actually increase pregnancies per AI at first service compared to submitting those cows to an estrus. And I'll just make a couple comments on that. We did a study a number of years ago where we randomized cows to get set up for first breeding with a double OVSync program. And I have to mention that includes the second prostaglandin within the second OVSync. That's really what made these programs fertility programs, the addition of that second prostaglandin. And they were either submitted to a double OVSync program or they were submitted to a synchronized estrus. So we had a way that we could synchronize them and bring the cows into heat and catch them in heat. And there was a 10 percentage point advantage for the double OVSync protocol compared to estrus. It was close to 50% for double OVSync. It was just 40% or so for the estrus. So that's just the conception rate side of the equation. The other side of that equation is what percentage of cows you can breed. And what I always tell people is you get, if you put your cows on a fertility program for first breeding, you get half of them pregnant. And the cows that go into that program, that includes the anovular cows. It includes all the cows, right? So you're breeding 100% of the cows, you're getting half of them pregnant. In our study, we only were able to catch about 70%, 75% of the cows in estrus, and only got about 40% of those cows pregnant. So if you calculate the percentage of cows pregnant after that first service, it's like half of them versus 30%. And so again, Richard was talking earlier about how critical this first service is. The first service is critical because one thing we know, the cows aren't pregnant. We can do any kind of manipulation we want coming into that. These programs are a little bit complicated with the number of treatments you have to give. But boy, I tell you, now with the technology that we have with these fertility programs, it's just a really good way to go. So that would be a strong recommendation I would make for them. And I think, Victor, I wanted to kind of circle back to your question about 21-day pregnancy rates. So you said this herd was running at 23.
22.
That's quite low for a preg rate nowadays, at least in the upper Midwest here. I would say they want to be in the high 20s to low to mid 30s. Is the farms that are doing really well can hit that. And a big component of that is the first breeding program. And I think just the change away, like Richard and I are saying, from a straight OVSync to a fertility program is going to get them a long ways toward pushing that pregnancy rate a lot higher. Now, another component of that is what you do after first breeding, which is a resync question and how we handle that part of it, but which is a big key to the equation. But a big part of it's that first breeding. Boy, I tell you though, the dairies that can get this done correctly and they have healthy cows, we just saw, and combined with the high fertility cycle, we just saw preg rates explode. The first preg rate graph I ever saw was from back about 20 years ago. It didn't go above 30. They cut the graph off at 30 on the high end because I think they thought anything above 30 was just wrong. The data was just completely wrong. Now we've got herds hitting 35. Some of these Jersey herds are hitting 40% 21-day pregnancy rates. We just never used to see pregnancy rates that high. The last thing I'll make a comment on, and it's a question that I'm getting a lot, because now we're using a lot of sex semen. We're using, and why are we using sex semen? Because we've got fertility so high in these lactating dairy cows. You know, when we had 30% conception rates, nobody wanted to use sex semen in a lactating dairy cow. Coming off these fertility programs, first lactation cows, we can see 60% conception rates. And so now we're seeing a lot of sex semen being used.
I think you guys mentioned a lot of important things. I kind of want to jump into another scenario, but we're going to switch to the high plains. So in the high plains area, where Victor and I are at, we deal with heat stress a lot. And originally coming from Idaho, I mean, I understood what heat was because we kind of have, you know, heat, drier heat, but down here in Texas, we get this humidity and it's awful. It's almost like you can't even breathe. But so on this example herd, they have pretty low milk production, but they're housed in a Saudi facility and they're milked twice a day. And this herd uses a pre-sync, but also cherry picks after that second prostaglandin. And then cows that aren't bred based on estrus detection, they're enrolled into a co-sync. We had talked about the co-sync protocol 14 days after the pre-sync. So the current reproductive efficiency of these cows is going to be they have a voluntary waiting period of 55 days. Their conception rate is 35%. Their service rate or heat detection is 73%, and then 21-day pregnancy rate of 26. So Dr. Pursley, I want to start with you. What are some of the programs that you might see fitting into this, or adjustments that this producer could make, and why 6%?
26. So it's pretty good, actually, to be quite honest, for this. To me, it looks like with the program they're using, it could be better. So I'm just going by what their numbers are right now, and 26. You know, that's pretty good for in an area where there's a lot of heat stress. Can't argue with that too much, I'd have to say. But you take in consideration the program. Can you improve fertility on the program? Yes. By not cherry picking, that's one thing. By doing something different than co-sync, that's two things. So here's the thing I was thinking about when you were talking about this. People make these decisions, and so they're going along. Their preg rate's not bad, 26%. You're still dealing with a lot of cows that didn't get pregnant out here for first AI. So you're pushing a lot of cows out. You're having to work with them again. I mean, so you know, I mean, it's one of these issues where why don't we get as many cows pregnant to begin with, and then you don't have to worry about them again, right? And so then you got fewer cows to work with as you're working through these programs. That's what I was thinking about when you were talking about this, and to me, that kind of logic makes a lot of sense. You know, let's just get these as high a percentage pregnant as possible for first AI, and in that case, you know, we're going to sound like, you know, just going to be going over and over again, but probably a double sync would be the best way to do this. That's my thoughts on that. I think 30 is reasonable. I don't know what Paul thinks.
So if you just look at their metrics, I agree with Richard. 26 for a preg rate is not too bad. If you look at the costs or the benefits of a preg rate, you're getting to the point on that cost curve where increasing it a lot more is probably a law of diminishing returns that's happening there. 70-some% service rate, that's really high. So I'm assuming they have relatively good heat detection. What's really holding it back is that conception rate at 35%. And part of that's the heat stress, and part of it we can't do a lot about, but I think you could do better with a fertility program. What I run into with dairies like that is they're going to tell me if I make the recommendation like Richard, where you guys should put in kind of a full sync program for first breeding, they're going to complain that it's too labor intensive. They're going to say, well, we've got really good heat detection here, and we want to breed our cows to heat. We don't want to run a whole program. And if you say don't do a co-sync on the cows that get to the ob-sync, they're going to say, well, only 15 to 20% of our cows get there. It's not worth it for me to do the non-co, to actually do the afternoon. So they're going to, my experience, I guess, Richard, with some of these kinds of herds is they're going to shoot me down on most of those recommendations, regardless of whether they're going to improve things or not. And when they do that, I just say, okay, then you better be happy with a 26% 21-day preg rate. I mean, that's what it's going to be. And to tell you the honest truth, it's not too bad. That's not like I'm not going to walk into a herd like that and say, this is red alert. You're having big problems here, right? So it comes down to then what I said at the very beginning. What are the goals of the herd, and what are they willing to do? So I agree with Richard. You can probably get better 21-day pregnancy rate. It's whether they feel that they can put the resources and time to improve it. And a lot of those herds in that part of the country just don't want to do the more intensive programs. And so you know what I'm talking about, Jennifer, and Victor, you know, in Kansas too. Some of these herds, dry lot dairies, maybe they don't have headlocks. Maybe it's really difficult to catch cows and give them their treatments. If it gets muddy, it's a disaster because the cows are slopping through mud and stuff. So this is, I guess, where I would go back to what I said in the beginning too. You know, I'm not going to, the herds are going to achieve reproductive success, maybe in some different ways. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, Jennifer. I do want to bring up one other thing that I just thought of, which I think is a really important thing that I've seen. We have a couple dairies here in Wisconsin now that have gone to the pneumatic guns to give their treatments. They're manufactured in Iowa. They're actually made for swine. They use pressure to inject the hormones. So what they did is they put a platform on their rotary, and they've got two guys on that platform, and they've got Parlor Boss. Okay, so Parlor Boss is you've got the big TV, a 42-inch TV screen, and so as the cows are coming around on the rotary, it lists the cow numbers and exactly what they need. And so the two guys, they're not walking, they're on this platform. Now, here's the other thing. Every cow goes through the parlor. Doesn't matter if she's in the right pen or the wrong pen, every cow goes through the parlor. So they don't miss cows. They don't miss them also because they've got, good RFID. They come in and they've got the Parlor Boss, and then they're using this pressure system to deliver the hormones. And I just think it's a great system. I've thought for a long time we need a different way to administer these treatments. They're doing it because of leukosis. They export embryos internationally, and so they're trying to eliminate leukosis, which they can do with these pressurized guns. So I'm just wanting to bring that up as kind of a neat system that I've seen that I think is really got some good aspects about it. So for the herd that you're talking about, sending guys out, chasing cows, that can be a very daunting task, but going to something like what I just described might actually be a way they could actually achieve a more intensive reproductive management program. And they may or may not be aware of that. So I just wanted to bring that up, Jennifer.
One of the things that we have not talked yet is these programs, they are consistent if we do the right things at the right time. So, if there is a cow in heat, there is no need for a person to take a decision whether which cows needs to be inseminated or at what time he's going to inseminate that cow or things like that. But also, if this herd doesn't want to change the Repro program, let's say for something more intense, do you think, or what would be your idea or your advice on delaying the voluntary waiting period a little bit on a herd like this? Would that benefit at all, or?
No, I'd make it worse because you're just delaying pregnancy. And you're probably not going to change the numbers too much, to be quite honest. And once again, go back to what we said at the beginning, we need to get as many cows pregnant as soon as possible as we can, especially on first AI. So I would not do that. If anything, we probably should be thinking a little bit the other way, keeping in mind not reducing milk production, by inseminating too early, but I think going the other way anymore, I don't think that's a reasonable thing to do. I know it seemed like a reasonable thing to do in the past, but no, I can't buy into that one.
Yeah, and I'll take a shot at this one too, Victor. I think this is a great topic, voluntary waiting period question. I agree with Richard. I mean, when you have that low of a conception rate, the only thing you can do is really crank up that service rate, which is what this herd has done, which is why they're getting 26%. But having said that, you have to get started, right? So when people ask me about the voluntary waiting period, I always use a scenario. I say, imagine that you have a magic wand in your hand, and with this magic wand, you can walk up to any cow in your herd at any day in milk and tap her on the head, and she gets pregnant. So that's what that represents is 100% conception rate. That's essentially what the wand represents. And I just asked groups of farmers, when would you want to get your cows pregnant? If you could decide exactly when to get them pregnant, when would you want to do that? Most farmers will say 90, 110, 120 days. And I always ask them, well, why do you have a 50-day voluntary waiting period? Well, it's because you've got low service rates and low conception rates. That's why you have to get started. What we have with fertility programs is essentially half of a magic wand. Now we've got 50% conception rates. And what the economic models, this is really an economic modeling question. What they would say is for the average cow, and of course this is going to differ based on parity and lots of things, but for the average cow, based on her lactation curve, right? You want to get them pregnant around 110 days, 110 to 120 days of milk. So you can kind of figure that out. And one thing I always ask farmers to do is run days open in your herd. So you can do that by, looking at Repro code 5 and 6 in dairy comps. So you're looking at your pregnant and dry cows. When do they get pregnant? What is their average days open? And what's the distribution of days open? And I've gotten, Richard, this is a really funny story. I've gotten some interesting questions lately, and it's becoming more and more frequent. I had a veterinarian friend call me up and he said, we got a problem with this herd. Repro problem. So he's calling me about the repro problem. I said, all right, what's the problem? He goes, well, this herd, they have almost a 40% 21-day preg rate. And their average days open just dropped below 100. Now that's a new repro problem, right?
Their problem is drying cows off, right?
Well, they'll talk about that, Richard. Exactly. And that's another conversation we can have. But this is what's happening now. Again, I've been doing this for 25 years, working with extension. I never used to get that question. Days open just dropped below 100. So what's happening? We've got repro really good. And so what can you do? Well, there is one thing you can do. You can increase the voluntary waiting period. And I think you can titrate that a bit in a herd, depending on the reproductive performance. But when I look in our UW herd, we're running about a 30% pregnancy rate. We've got a 76 to 80 some day voluntary waiting period. And our average days open sits right at about 110, which is where I want to see it. If I have a herd that drops below 100, I'm going to say you can push that voluntary waiting period out a week and see where that goes. And there are some herds that are pushing their voluntary waiting periods into the 80s easily with these. If you're getting averaging 50% or better conception rate at first service, you certainly don't want a 55-day voluntary waiting period. But that's assuming. Now, one other caveat here. I would never recommend delaying a voluntary waiting period unless you're using a fertility program and you get your cows inseminated at the end of that voluntary waiting period. I think it's very dangerous to increase voluntary waiting periods in herds that are just waiting for the cows to come into estrus.
Yeah. All of our double OpSync herds, I think, for the most part, are in this. Not all, but a lot of them are in. We're telling them somewhere between 75 and 85. Yep. So if it's on a weekly basis, you're looking at 77 to 83, that type of thing. So that's about where we're at. I wouldn't, when I said I wouldn't increase from there. I think that's enough. On this herd,
unless their days open drop below 100, Richard.
What was the voluntary waiting period on this?
Well, they were in that 70 some day range, but they had a very high preg rate, and they're pushed. The herd wanted to move their voluntary waiting period like by 3 weeks, into the 100-day rate. I said, don't do that. Go by a week and see where it goes. But I think they're sitting around maybe close to low 90s now. And again, again, this is a new problem with repro. It's a problem we've never dealt with before, but the fact that we can, I believe, get cows pregnant too quickly if you're really good at repro. And again, so I think looking at that days open now, there are some studies out there that have looked at the economics of all this, and it's probably true. Every cow has their own ideal voluntary waiting period. We may get to the day when we have big data, we're getting close now, where our computer management software says what the voluntary, if you're using a timed AI program, what should the voluntary waiting period for this cow be? And it'll just set it, program it. Maybe it's different for the younger cows versus the older cows. Maybe it's different for higher producing cows versus lower producing cows. But we may be getting to a time when that can just be handled. And we won't have just a uniform voluntary waiting period across the entire herd.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, let me ask you, because we have talked a lot about first service. So let's ask you about re-insemination. So for re-inseminating an open cow, we need either one of two things. One, that she comes back to estrus and we detect that cow in estrus, right? Or the second, that we break check that cow and we call that cow an open cow. So on the break check side, you guys thought that these time artificial insemination programs change also the preg diagnosis industry, the preg check, because we are doing Monday, Tuesday, things like that. So the question is, how early would it be okay to preg check my animals? And also, what type of method should I consider?
So I think that historically people have looked at non-pregnancy diagnosis, that the earlier the better. Mm-hmm. I think we need to think about that a little bit, because the problem, no matter what method you use, the earlier you detect pregnancy, these animals are at a high risk for loss, right?
Correct.
And this problem stems from the fact that we have to find cows, touch cows, put our arm in cows, take a blood sample from the cows, ultrasound the cows. We have to pick and choose when we're going to do it the first time and when we're going to do it a second time and when we're going to do it a third time. Let's imagine a scenario in the future. Let's say we come up with some marker in milk for a pregnancy. And so every time the cow is milked, we're doing a preg test. Then this particular problem that I'm talking about goes away, because every time the cow goes through the parlor, she's preg checked, right? But when we have to choose days, that's kind of what we're locked into in our systems right now. Let's think about the scenarios. So I think there's two kinds of herds that I see. My opinion, after first breeding, I'm sold. I think Richard and I are both in agreement on this. I think a fertility program for first breeding makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. Okay, let's assume that that's our first breeding program. After first breeding, if I have a heat detection system, the earliest non-pregnancy diagnosis I can do is to catch those cows coming back into heat. And so if you've bought a heat detection system, an accelerometer system, use that to catch those cows coming back into heat. Now that distribution is going to go from about 18 days to about 32 days. It's going to be a normal distribution around that particular period of time, right? By the time you get to day 32, if a cow's going to show a heat, she's probably already done so. So that's a nice time to come in and resynchronize the cows. Okay, so one type of herd is I want to combine heat detection with a resync program. Okay, so that's what I would recommend, a day 32 resync. We call it a day 32 resync, because now you're maximizing the cows that come back into heat. You breed those cows. Your fertility might be lower, but it's earlier. You're getting that pregnancy earlier. And then by day 32, there's different schemes you can come in and do this. But anyhow, that's one scenario. We'd still have some herds that, and this is another thing you have to think about, when you run a timed AI program and a heat detection program side by side in the same herd, you have to manage two programs, right? You've got to generate all the lists for the treatments. You got to have the crew to give the right treatments on the right day. You got to do all the timed AIs. but you also have to walk and chalk every day, lock down cows every day, or you have to, you know, run your lists and do your heat detection thing twice a day or whatever. So you're running two programs. So there are some herds, our university herd is one of them, that just focuses on resynchronization, sync and resync. We're not going to catch a lot of cows in heat. If that's the case, I think earlier is better. And the way we do that is we come in on day 25 and give a setup treatment of GnRH. And then on day 32, we do an ultrasound. That's a beautiful time to do an ultrasound. You're very accurate. You can see live versus dead embryos and all that kind of stuff. And then resynchronize the cows. So those are the two kinds of herds. And the one thing I would say for you guys in the South, in kind of where you guys are, Jennifer and Victor, a problem with doing that earlier resync is you force so many cows through the protocol, and they don't like to give all those treatments and stuff, right? They'd rather catch the cows in heat. So in your parts of the world, catch those cows coming back into heat, do the day 32 resync. You got the best of both worlds. There are some herds up here that would rather do the earlier resync and go that way. So that's kind of the way that things have fallen out. I don't know what you think, Richard or Victor.
Well, I have kind of a follow-up question on that. It's and it affects the first question on the timing, that 32 day. So I've seen some herds doing preg checks every week, but I've seen some dairies doing preg checks every 2 weeks, or sometimes even every 3 weeks. So
okay, the best, if I go to a herd, a large herd, that's not doing weekly preg checks, that's the first thing they can do to improve repro. There's a misconception that non-pregnant cows will all be caught coming back into heat. That's not true. I mean, there's a lot of cows that you don't see coming back into heat. So you have to do these preg checks. When you increase your preg check interval, you're just taking longer to take action on the non-pregnant cows. And so if I go to a herd and they're once a month preg checking, they can make substantial improvements by going to weekly. Now, I understand in some of these places, if you're in the middle of Kansas and there's no good dairy veterinarians around that can do early preg checking, that's why they're spreading these intervals. But there are technologies you could use on the off weeks, like a PAG test. There's the blood test, there's the milk test. We have all kinds of technologies. And then when the vets come in every other week or every 3 weeks or month or whatever, then they can clean up a lot of the issues with an ultrasound.
You know, we're seeing more large herds, especially in areas where, like you're saying, there's not veterinarian close by that can do this, do lots of cows. Seeing more and more herds hiring their own in-house people to do these kinds of things. And you know, it's really goes back to the same thing as anything else. It's training and making sure that those things are really, really good. I you know, you see a lot of different things happening, and you just want to make sure they're trained really well and understand what they're seeing. One of the advantages of ultrasound is to see other things, and you know, veterinarians are trained, you know, to see other things with ultrasound, and can utilize those technologies really, really well, and really have come a long way in the last 10 or 15 years in that regard, understanding exactly, you know, what the pregnancy should look like. Is this, you know, is there going to be a little bit of separation of membranes there? Are they going to lose this pregnancy? That's just awesome. You know, people that aren't trained well, that aren't veterinarians per se, may not recognize these things. On the other hand, the PAGs are 100%. You know, to be quite honest, you get out to 32 days, it's 100%. Now, it could be that the animal's already lost the pregnancy, you know, and the PAG's still high, but it's still, she was pregnant, you know, and it's 100% in that regard. It's you have to expect that some cows are going to lose those pregnancies, and got to be aware of that in the management system that they set up. So I really like either one. I think, you know, the PAGs are very, very accurate. Ultrasound can be very, very accurate. Sometimes you see things that maybe not so accurate if they're not trained well, if they're not trained veterinarians. And so I like either way, and I think there's a lot of options for people to use. Like Paul was saying, I really think the options are it's great, and there's more options now than we've ever had. So it's whatever people are comfortable with, and the expertise they have on the farm, I think is the main thing.
So the one thing I wanted to follow up on that, Richard, is that I think the key to a resync is the presence or absence of the corpus luteum. We kind of learned that a while back. And so I think a very successful and a way to increase your conception rate to these resyncs is at a non-pregnancy diagnosis, the non-pregnant cows with a CL can either start the protocol or complete the protocol, depending on whether or not you gave GnRH a week ahead of time.
Right.
They seem to do really well. They seem to have relatively good fertility. It's just like Richard said, it's these cows that don't have a CL. They're open and they don't have a CL. And we did some work on this. It's not just because they're anovular. There's some cows that do kind of move in and out of this anovular condition. It's just that they don't all have an exactly 21-day cycle, right? Yeah. So some of them have longer cycles and things. So there's about 20% of open cows on day 32, for example, don't have a CL, which confuses a lot of veterinarians because it's like they all cycle at 21. They should all have a CL, right? But they don't all cycle at 21 days. Pregnancy loss plays a role in all these kinds of things. So for those cows that don't have a CL, there's a few options for the resync. You could use a progesterone insert. So it's just essentially an off sync, putting a CEDAR in at the GnRH, pulling it at the prostaglandin. That seems to work really well. You could do, if you've set them up with the GnRH ahead of time, you could just restart an off sync, and they're essentially getting a GG PPG type of an approach, and that seems to work well. And what some veterinarians I know do is they just start them a week later. So they don't have a CL now. Next week they should have a CL, and so they'll just wait a week. And so there's different ways to do that. I think the most aggressive thing is to use a CEDAR because you don't have to wait. The other methods, if you're going to do a GG PG, you lose a week. A week is worth about 4 percentage points in conception rate. So you're losing some time. So anything that you do that can increase conception rate by more than 4 or 5 percentage points, you're going to be ahead doing those kinds of things. So people have settled into kind of pretty standardized resync type programs now. It used to be very confusing, Richard, I would say, what protocol we're going to use for first breeding and how we're going to do the resync. Now things have settled into some pretty standardized options. I guess it's not like Baskin Robbins with 60 some flavors anymore. It's like we've got a few options for first service that work really well, and we've got a few reasonable options for a resync.
This has been a great conversation, and I think that you guys have both discussed some really important factors that are affecting reproductive success and breeding strategies for dairy herds. And we wanted to thank you guys so much again for being with us, Dr. Fricke and Dr. Persley. This is our first podcast of the Repro spot, so we really appreciate you guys kind of being our first. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to. It's really cringeworthy to watch myself talk, but I'm looking forward to. I'm looking forward to watching it.